The night of the 21st of August, 1942, exploded across a sandbar at the mouth of the Iwo River, and 800 men died in the space of a few hours. Muzzle flashes ripped the darkness. Machine gun fire scythed through ranks of charging soldiers who had been promised an easy victory. Bodies fell into the black water and floated there tangled in the shallows, while the survivors kept coming and kept dying. Colonel Kiyono Ichiki had led 900 veterans of the China campaign in a screaming frontal assault across open ground. Certain that spiritual intensity would shatter a force his intelligence had described as demoralized and undersupplied. By dawn, his regiment was destroyed. Ichiki burned his regimental colors in the sand and killed himself, rather than report the catastrophe to his commanders. This is not a story about American mythology. America has enough of those. This is a story about what the men on the other side said when their finest defenses failed, when their most careful plans dissolved, when they came face to face with something they could not explain and could not stop. It is the story of what the Imperial Japanese Army learned about the United States Marine Corps across 3 years and dozens of islands told in their own words. And it begins with a question Tokyo could not answer. In the summer of 1942, Imperial General Headquarters was confronting a problem it had not planned for. Japan had swept across Asia with terrifying speed. It had taken Singapore in 70 days, a fortress the British had called impregnable. It had driven the Americans out of the Philippines. In the space of 6 months, it had built an empire stretching from Burma to the edges of Alaska. The Japanese soldier was not a fool. He was not untrained. He was among the most experienced and disciplined infantrymen on Earth, hardened by years of continuous war. And yet the planners in Tokyo were staring at a new variable, arriving in the Pacific Theater in numbers that were beginning to concern them. Not the American Army, which Japan had studied and understood to be a conventional force responding to conventional pressures. This other branch, this corps, these men who called themselves Marines. Who were they? What were their limits? How would they break and under what pressure? The Japanese did not know, and the not knowing was itself a kind of danger. The Japanese respected the American Army as a large industrial force, dangerous in mass, but predictable in method. This other thing, these Marines did not fit any file they held. There were no comfortable precedents, no reassuring studies, no confident estimate of where the breaking point lay. So they decided to find out the only way a military ever truly learns anything about an enemy. They would test them in battle, and they would take that enemy's measure in the one currency that never lies, the currency of blood. The place they chose was Guadalcanal, a small, sweltering island in the Solomon Chain, where the Japanese were building an airstrip that could dominate the sea lanes to Australia. In August of 1942, the 1st Marine Division landed there and seized the half-finished field. The Japanese garrison did not believe the Marines could hold what they had taken, and this was not arrogance. It was a reasonable reading of a desperate situation. The Marines had come ashore with insufficient supplies. Within 2 days, they were cut off by one of the worst naval defeats in American history, a catastrophe off Savo Island that sent 4 Allied cruisers to the bottom in less than 40 minutes and left the men on the beach alone. The jungle around them was a biological nightmare of malaria, dysentery, and fungal rot that ate through skin and boot leather alike. They were hungry, sick, abandoned, and surrounded. Every rule of war said they should crack. When the Japanese counterattack came, it was supposed to be the pressure that finished them. Instead, it produced Ichiki's slaughter on the sandbar, and it produced something the planners had not expected. It produced testimony. One of Ichiki's surviving lieutenants, recovered from the jungle 3 weeks later, gave a statement to his superiors that was remarkable for its honesty. He said the Marines did not retreat when they should have retreated. They fought from positions no military logic would have chosen. And most disturbing of all, they seemed to find the Japanese determination to die in battle amusing rather than terrifying. That phrase, amusing rather than terrifying, lodged itself in the minds of Japanese planners, and it would return again and again in the testimonials that followed over the next 3 years. The Marines' apparent indifference to tactics built around the acceptance of death. Their refusal to be demoralized by circumstances that would have demoralized anyone. It was not recklessness. It was something far more unsettling. It was competence so deeply embedded that it had become instinct. But everything the men in the jungle observed was still just observation. Nobody in Tokyo yet understood the machine that had produced these men, and that machine had been forged, not on any battlefield, but in 2 decades of a war the Marines had fought over their own survival. Because the Marine Corps had nearly been abolished after the First World War. The Army considered it redundant. Congress considered it expensive. And so the Corps had survived by seizing a mission no one else wanted. A mission almost everyone believed was flatly impossible. The seizure of fortified islands from the sea against a defended shore. In the 1920s and 1930s, the conventional wisdom of every serious military mind was absolute on this point. Amphibious assault against prepared defenses could not be done. Gallipoli in the First World War had proven it a catastrophe that had drowned a generation of British and Australian soldiers in blood on a beach they could never leave. The experts had studied Gallipoli and concluded that the modern defender, armed with machine guns and artillery, held an insurmountable advantage over any force trying to cross open water and open sand. The idea of doing it deliberately, as doctrine, was viewed inside professional military circles as something close to institutional suicide. And that was precisely the idea a small group of Marine officers decided to build their entire future upon. They were not glamorous men. They were majors and colonels working in obscure schoolhouses at Quantico with chalkboards and mimeographed papers, men whose names the public would never learn. And they did something strange. Instead of studying victories, they studied every failed landing in the history of warfare. They took Gallipoli apart hour by hour, decision by decision, and asked not why it failed, but what would have had to be true for it to succeed. They asked what specialized boats would be needed to carry men and vehicles onto a hostile beach. They asked how naval guns could be coordinated to suppress defenders in the exact minutes the boats were most vulnerable. They asked how a squad of men could keep functioning after their officer was killed, their radio destroyed, and their formation shredded in the surf. They were solving on paper a problem the entire military establishment had already declared unsolvable. And they were building something no one could yet see, because the only proof would come when the theory met a real beach under real fire. They wrote it all down. In 1934, the results were assembled into a document called The Tentative Manual for Landing Operations, a dry, unglamorous title for what was in truth a blueprint for the impossible. Every principle of the amphibious assaults that would later shock the world was already there on paper years before a single shot was fired in the Pacific. How to organize the ship-to-shore movement. How to time the naval bombardment so it lifted at the exact moment the first boats touched sand. How to command a battle where the front line was a moving wall of surf. The manual was so far ahead of its equipment that much of the gear it demanded did not yet exist, and had to be invented from scratch, tested and refined in exercises that other branches watched with open skepticism. To the rest of the world, it looked frankly like a waste. Here was a branch fighting for its very survival, starved of money and respect, and its best minds were pouring their careers into perfecting a technique the smartest strategists on Earth had already ruled out as fantasy. There was no glory in it, and very little funding. The specialized landing craft they needed barely existed. The naval gunfire techniques they proposed were untested. Every exercise they ran was criticized as too extreme, too dangerous, too far beyond what realistic training should demand. But the men building the doctrine understood something their critics did not. They were not building a tactic. They were building a culture. They were designing an institution that would take ordinary young men, the sons of farmers and mechanics and dock workers, and reshape them so completely that each individual could carry the entire logic of the assault inside his own head. So that when everything fell apart, and it always fell apart, the attack would continue anyway. That was the insane idea. That was the forbidden gamble. And in August of 1942, on a jungle island most Americans had never heard of it, was finally going to be tested in earnest. The garrison commander who arrived to fix the situation after Ichiki's disaster was Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, and he did what a professional does. He studied the reports carefully. He adjusted his estimate of the Marine defenders sharply upward. And then he committed a far more serious force, 3,000 men under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, in a coordinated assault from 3 directions at once, timed for the night of the 12th of September, 1942. By any reasonable tactical standard, it was a vastly better plan than Ichiki's headlong charge. It used genuine deception, genuine coordination, genuine exploitation of the terrain. What it could not account for was the specific ground it had to cross and the specific men waiting on it. The objective was a narrow spine of coral and razor-edged kunai grass rising 250 feet above the jungle floor, a ridge that would soon carry the name of the Marine colonel who held it. The Japanese would have to attack uphill through jungle in darkness against Marines who had spent 3 weeks digging in and stringing wire. The men holding that ridge were Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's battalion, reinforced by the 1st Parachute Battalion, roughly 800 exhausted malaria-ridden Marines, against Kawaguchi's 3,000. The assault that began near midnight was not a single attack. It was wave after wave, each one absorbed, each one thrown back, each one costing the attackers far more than the defenders across a night that ground on for 9 relentless hours. And here the testimony sharpens. A Japanese company commander named Captain Toshio Koyama survived that assault, and years later, he tried to put into words what it had been like. He said he had tried many times to explain attacking that ridge. The Marines, he said, were not defending it. They were hunting. The Japanese outnumbered them nearly 4 to 1. They had surprise. They had the momentum of the charge. And still, every time they broke through the line, there were Marines behind the breakthrough attacking into their flanks, as if the breakthrough itself was exactly what those Marines had been waiting for. They did not fight like men who were afraid, Koyama said. They fought like men who were angry. When the sun rose over the ridge, Kawaguchi had lost roughly 1,200 men. Edson had lost 164 killed and wounded. The ridge held. The airstrip held. And from that night, the strategic momentum of the entire Pacific War began quietly to shift. But the numbers were not the thing that haunted Tokyo. It was the analysis. A Japanese intelligence report captured on Guadalcanal that November contained an assessment that would later be quoted in American after-action studies, and it cut to the heart of what they were facing. The Marine, it said, was trained to use violence the way a craftsman uses a tool, without passion, without hesitation, adjusted precisely to the task at hand. And this, the report warned, was more dangerous than ferocity, because ferocity can be exhausted and ferocity can be surprised. The craftsman cannot be surprised by his own work. Somewhere in the ruin of Kawaguchi's assault, Japanese intelligence had glimpsed the machine the Quantico schoolhouses had built, and they had begun dimly to understand it. The trouble was that understanding a thing and stopping it are not the same. They could name what made the Marines dangerous. They still had no idea how to build a wall high enough to hold them, and every passing month brought the next brutal test that much closer. Because the phrase "cannot be surprised by his own work" pointed at the exact thing those obscure officers had designed a decade earlier. The Corps had deliberately trained its men for the moment of maximum disorganization. For the instant when the officer is dead, the radio is smashed, the flanks have collapsed, and a single Marine alone must make an immediate tactical decision, with no one left to give the order. The result was that individual Marines at the level of the squad and the fire team could improvise under pressure in ways that repeatedly stunned Japanese commanders trained to expect a rigid, hierarchical response to any disruption. Break the structure of a Japanese unit, and it faltered while it waited for the mind above it to issue commands. Break the structure of a Marine unit, and nothing seemed to change at all, because the structure was not sitting above the men in a chain of command. It had been installed inside each of them one repetition at a time, until it was no longer a set of orders but a reflex. This was the great asymmetry, and the Japanese were only beginning to see its shape. Japanese doctrine had made the officer the mind and the soldier the body. cut off the mind, and the body froze, waiting for direction that would never come. Marine doctrine had done something almost heretical by comparison. It had distributed the mind across every single man in the formation so that there was, in the end, no single point of failure to attack. You could kill the officer, and the plan lived on in the sergeant. You could kill the sergeant, and it lived on in the corporal and in the rifleman beside him, and in the wounded man still crawling forward with a grenade. The Japanese were beginning to sense this. They did not yet grasp how deep it went, or how completely it would defeat every clever defense they were about to construct against it. By early 1944, the evidence was multiplying. On Cape Gloucester, in January of that year, a Japanese battalion commander named Major Komori Yoshitaka was killed leading the defense of a prepared strongpoint, and his operations diary was recovered afterward by Marine intelligence. In it, in the days before he died, Komori described watching a Marine patrol through his binoculars. They moved as a single organism, he wrote, yet they seemed to think as separate minds. He compared them to a school of fish, changing direction, no visible signal passing between them, and yet all of them turning together and turning correctly. He confessed that he did not understand the mechanism. And with a soldier's grim honesty, he added that he was not certain it could be countered by the dispositions he had available. 3 days later, his dispositions were tested by the men he had watched. They could not be countered. He was right about that, and it cost him his life. Across island after island, the Japanese kept observing the same phenomenon, kept describing it with the same bafflement, and kept failing to build a defense that could stop it. And what they had seen so far on the jungle ridges and the coral patrols was only the beginning. Everything until now had been the Marines fighting on ground. The Japanese had chosen imperfectly defenses thrown up in haste plans. Improvised against an enemy Tokyo was only starting to comprehend. But the Japanese are learning. They are studying every campaign, translating every captured document, rebuilding their entire defensive doctrine around what the Marines have shown them. They are about to stop throwing men away in frontal charges. They are about to dig into the coral itself to build fortresses out of islands, to design killing grounds, engineered for the single purpose of drowning the Marine assault in its own blood, before it can ever cross the sand. On a tiny fortified atoll called Betio in the Tarawa chain, a Japanese admiral is about to declare that the Americans could not take his island with 1 million men in 100 years. He has 4,700 defenders, 14 coastal guns, 500 machine gun nests, and every yard of approach covered by interlocking fire. He believes he has built the perfect answer to the Marines. And in a matter of months, the Marines are going to wade toward that beach through chest-deep water in the open under a storm of fire that will kill them by the hundreds in the first minutes. What happens on that reef will tell the world whether the Japanese have finally found the wall the Marines cannot climb, or whether the machine the schoolhouses built can survive even this. The answer will horrify Tokyo, and it will echo across every island still to come. And it is still only the second act. At 9:17 on the morning of the 20th of November 1943, the first Marines who reached the reef at Betio began to die in the water. The tide had betrayed them. Their landing boats slammed to a halt on a wall of coral 500 yards from the beach, ramps dropped, and the men stepped out into chest-deep lagoon under the concentrated fire of 500 machine guns. There was no cover. There was nowhere to go, but forward wading slow as a nightmare, while the water around them turned pink and then red, while men who had trained for 2 years fell without ever firing a shot. The Japanese gunners could not miss. The range was fixed. The targets were walking, and the killing was methodical. This was the moment Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki had promised would come. He had told his garrison that 1 million Americans could not take his island in 100 years, and for the length of that terrible wade across the lagoon, it looked as though he might be right. In the first part of this story, we watched Tokyo ask a question it could not answer. Who were these Marines, and where was their breaking point Guadalcanal had given the first brutal reply? Ichiki's regiment was slaughtered on a sandbar. Kawaguchi's 3,000 were broken on a jungle ridge, and Japanese officers began writing in their diaries about men who fought like a single organism, yet thought as separate minds. The amphibious doctrine that the whole military world had called impossible had survived its first real test. But Guadalcanal had been a jungle campaign, a battle of attrition on ground the Japanese had prepared in haste. Betio was something else. Betio was the pure form of the problem the Marines had spent 20 years trying to solve, and here, for the first time, that doctrine met a defender who had studied it. And now everything was about to get far worse. Betio was barely 2 miles long and 500 yards wide, a scrap of coral in the Tarawa atoll of the Gilbert Islands. There was nowhere on it that was not covered by fire. Shibazaki commanded roughly 4,800 men, and he had turned the island into a single interlocking weapon. 14 coastal guns, some of them heavy pieces capable of engaging warships. 40 artillery pieces. 500 machine gun nests. All of it connected by a web of trenches and buried bunkers roofed with coconut logs, coral and steel plate structures so solid that a direct hit from a naval shell would leave them intact. He had ringed the beaches with obstacles and mines, and a seawall of coconut logs designed to trap attackers in the exact zone where his guns were thickest. He was not relying on spirit. He was relying on engineering. And the engineering was very good. Betio had been transformed into what many considered the most heavily fortified square mile on the planet, defense concentrated to a density no attacker had faced before. Every approach had been surveyed, every field of fire calculated, every likely landing point pre-registered, so that his gunners could open up the instant a boat crossed a line drawn on a map. Shibazaki had done exactly what a professional does when he has studied his enemy. He had built a machine to kill the specific force coming for him, and he had reason to believe it would work. The problem the Marines faced was the reef. Betio sat inside a lagoon, and to reach the beaches, an assault force had to cross a shallow coral shelf that ordinary landing boats could not clear at low water. The planners knew this. They had studied the tides for months, and they had gambled that on the morning of the landing, the water over the reef would be deep enough to float the boats across. It was the kind of calculation that decided the fate of thousands of men, and it went wrong. A neap tide, a period of unusually weak tidal movement, held the water low over the reef on the day of the assault. The boats would ground. The men inside them would have to walk the rest of the way in. Everyone who understood the plan understood what that meant, and the meaning was measured in bodies. But there was one machine on Betio that did not care about the reef, and its story is the strangest thread in the whole battle. Years earlier, a wealthy engineer named Donald Roebling had built a tracked amphibious vehicle to rescue people stranded by hurricanes in the swamps of Florida. He called it the Alligator. It crawled through mud, swam through open water, and climbed obstacles that stopped everything else. It had nothing to do with war. It was a humanitarian machine built to save lives in a flood. And a handful of Marine officers watching it churn through terrain no boat could touch saw something the rest of the military did not. They saw the answer to the reef. They saw a vehicle that could carry men over the coral and keep going up onto the sand, delivering them ashore instead of dumping them into the water 500 yards out. Getting those machines to Tarawa in numbers was its own quiet war. The amphibian tractor, the Amtrak as the Marines came to call it, was still viewed by much of the establishment as an unproven curiosity, a supply vehicle at best, not an assault weapon. There were never enough of them. Major General Julian Smith, commanding the 2nd Marine Division, fought hard to gather every Amtrak he could beg or borrow, understanding that on a reef-guarded island, they were not a luxury, but the difference between a landing and a massacre. He managed to assemble enough to carry the first 3 waves. Only the first 3. Everyone who came after would ride the boats, and the boats would stop at the reef. The plan in the end was a race. The Amtraks would carry the lead waves across the coral and onto the beach. Everything depended on how much of the garrison those first men could suppress before the following waves reached the reef and had to wade. The bombardment before the landing was supposed to guarantee it. For hours, the warships offshore poured shells onto Peleliu, thousands of tons of high explosive falling on an island smaller than many airfields. To the men watching from the transports, it seemed impossible that anything could live through it. The whole island vanished under smoke and fire and flying coral. Confidence rose on the decks. Surely nothing was left to fight. But Shibazaki's bunkers had been built precisely to survive this, and most of them did. When the smoke cleared and the Amtraks began their run toward the beach, the Japanese gunners rose from their shelters, settled behind their weapons, and waited for the range to close. The bombardment had killed some of them. It had not broken the fortress. The wrong lesson had almost been learned, and it would be paid for in the next hour. The Amtraks came in first, and for a moment the gamble worked. The tracked machines clawed over the reef without slowing ground up onto the sand, and disgorged Marines directly into the fight. Colonel David Shoup, who commanded the assault forces on the beach, went ashore into a chaos that had no front line and no rear. Men were pinned against the seawall. Radios were flooded and dead. Officers were falling in the first minutes, and command was dissolving into hundreds of small, desperate decisions made by whoever was still standing. This was the exact condition the Marine Corps had trained for across 2 decades, the condition of maximum disorganization, and it was about to be tested at a scale and intensity nothing before it had approached. The Amtraks that survived turned around and crawled back over the reef to fetch more men running a shuttle through fire that destroyed them one after another. Then the boats arrived and the horror began in earnest. Wave after wave of landing craft slammed into the reef and could go no farther. The ramps dropped 500 yards out, and the Marines stepped into the lagoon. What followed was the scene that seared Tarawa into memory. Hundreds of men wading through waist-deep and chest-deep water, impossibly slow, silhouetted against the bright lagoon, while Shibazaki's machine guns swept them in long, patient bursts. Men fell and did not rise. The water grew crowded with the dead. Those who lived kept walking, holding rifles over their heads, stepping around the bodies of friends, closing the distance yard by yard toward a beach that was itself a killing ground. It should have broken them. By every calculation of what men can endure, that wade should have shattered the assault and thrown the survivors back into the sea. It did not. They came ashore in ones and twos and shattered handfuls, and they kept fighting. On the beach, there was no organized attack because organization had died in the water. Instead, there was something the Japanese had seen before and still could not counter: individual Marines and tiny fragments of squads improvising their way forward without orders, without officers, without any structure above them, because the structure was inside each of them. A sergeant would gather 3 strangers from 3 different units and lead them against a bunker. A private with a satchel charge would crawl alone to a firing slit and blow it shut. Flamethrower teams and demolition men worked the bunkers one by one close enough to touch them in a grinding, intimate foot-by-foot destruction of Shibazaki's fortress. There was no clever maneuver. There was only the relentless distributed pressure of men who had been built to keep going when everything had gone wrong. Shibazaki himself did not survive the day. His command bunker was struck, and the admiral who had promised 100 years of resistance was killed early in the battle, leaving his garrison to fight on without its coordinating mind. And here, the asymmetry that had haunted the Japanese since Guadalcanal repeated itself in reverse and at full, lethal scale. When the Japanese command structure was decapitated, the defense lost cohesion, degrading into isolated pockets, fighting bravely but without unity. When the Marine command structure was shredded in the water, the attack simply continued because it had never depended on a single mind in the first place. Peleliu became a battle of Marine improvisation against Japanese positions that could no longer be directed as a whole. The fortress was still deadly. It was no longer coherent, and the Marines fed men into it without pause. The fighting ground on for 76 hours. 3 days and 3 nights of close-quarters slaughter on a strip of coral bunker by bunker, until the last organized Japanese resistance was extinguished in a series of desperate final charges. When it ended, the numbers told a story that horrified everyone who read them. Of Shibazaki's garrison of roughly 4,800, About 4,690 were dead. 17 Japanese soldiers allowed themselves to be taken prisoner. 17 out of thousands. The rest had died in their bunkers or thrown themselves against the Marines rather than surrender. The Marines had taken the island in 76 hours, and they had paid for it with roughly 1,000 of their own killed and more than 2,000 wounded. A scrap of coral smaller than many towns had cost over 3,000 American casualties in 3 days. The shock at home was immediate and severe. Photographs and film came back showing American dead floating in the lagoon and heaped on the sand, and a public that had grown used to advancing headlines suddenly saw the true price of the Pacific in raw, uncensored images. There was an uproar. People demanded to know how such casualties could be justified for an island most had never heard of. Commanders had to explain painfully that this was the actual cost of storming a defended shore, the cost the military establishment had always predicted when it called amphibious assault impossible. The doctrine had worked. Betio had fallen. But it had fallen at a price that forced the entire American war machine to stop and study exactly what had gone wrong and what had gone right on that reef. And what they concluded changed everything that came after. Tarawa was the most expensive lesson of the amphibious war, and the Marines learned it completely. Never again would they trust a single tide calculation with the lives of a division, and future landings would be timed and scouted with obsessive care. Never again would they assume that a naval bombardment, however massive, could destroy bunkers built to survive it, and future bombardments would grow longer, heavier, and aimed with far greater precision at fortifications that had to be cracked open individually. Above all, they would never again go in short of Amtraks. The tracked machines that had crawled over the reef while the boats died on it had proven their worth in blood, and from Tarawa forward, they would be built by the thousand and would carry Marines over every reef in the Pacific. The near catastrophe had corrected the doctrine, and the corrected doctrine would be nearly unstoppable. The proof came quickly. Only weeks later at Kwajalein, in the Marshall Islands, the same Marines applied everything Tarawa had taught them: a longer and more accurate bombardment, careful reconnaissance, and swarms of Amtraks carrying the assault waves all the way to the beach. The result was a landing accomplished at a fraction of the cost, an island seized with comparatively light casualties, against a garrison as determined as any. Tarawa had been the classroom. Kwajalein was the exam, and the Marines passed it with a fluency that stunned observers who had feared another bloodbath. The terrible arithmetic of Betio had bought a competence that would save thousands of lives on every reef still to come. For the Japanese Tarawa produced a different kind of reckoning, and it was the one that mattered most to the men on the other side of the wire. Shibazaki had built the finest defense Japan had yet constructed. He had studied the Marines, engineered a fortress specifically to drown them at the waterline, and inflicted casualties heavy enough to shake the American public. And he had still lost the island in 3 days and died in his own command post. The Japanese officers who analyzed Betio afterward arrived at a conclusion that would appear years later in their official military history, and it was a confession disguised as analysis. They had built their defense around the expectation of normal behavior, around the assumption that men crossing that reef under that fire would break as normal men break. The Marines had not broken. And so the analysts wrote with brutal clarity, they had built the wrong defense. They had built the wrong defense. The phrase carried a weight that went far beyond a single battle. It was an admission that the entire logic on which Japan had planned to hold the Pacific was flawed at its foundation. Japanese doctrine assumed that sufficiently heavy fire applied at the right moment would shatter the will of any attacker, because that was how it understood the relationship between fear and combat. But the Marines had shown on that reef that their combat performance did not collapse under conditions that should have collapsed it. Their capacity to keep functioning was not a matter of will that could be broken. It was a matter of training so deep it survived the destruction of everything around it. No wall of fire could reach the place where that capacity lived, because it lived inside each individual man, and you could not kill your way to it fast enough. That realization forced a transformation in Japanese strategy and it is the transformation that sets up everything still to come. If the Marines could not be stopped at the waterline, if no defense built to break them at the moment of landing would hold, then the Japanese would stop trying to break them at the beach at all. They would let the Marines come ashore. They would abandon the wasteful frontal charges and the banzai attacks that flung men against Marine firepower for nothing. Instead, they would burrow into the islands themselves, turning them into vast underground fortresses of tunnels and caves and mutually supporting positions, defenses designed not to win, but to make the Marines pay for every yard in a slow, grinding, methodical harvest of American lives. If they could not stop the machine, they would try to bleed it white and make the cost of victory so appalling that America might lose its will to keep paying. The next islands would be built to kill Marines slowly. On a place called Peleliu, a colonel named Kunio Nakagawa was already studying every Marine campaign available to him and rebuilding Japanese defensive doctrine from the ground up, abandoning the banzai charge digging cave systems into the coral ridges, preparing a defense in depth that a 4-day operation would take more than 2 months to break. And far to the north on a volcanic island called Iwo Jima, a general named Tadamichi Kuribayashi was preparing to take this new philosophy to its ultimate and most terrible conclusion, forbidding suicide charges entirely and engineering 16 miles of tunnels for the single purpose of making the Marines suffer as no attacking force had ever suffered before. The Japanese had finally understood what they were facing. They had accepted at last that the Marines could not be broken at the shore, and so they set out to prove that even an unbreakable force could be bled to death one man at a time. The real slaughter was only just beginning. At 8:32 on the morning of the 15th of September 1944, the Amtraks carrying the 1st Marine Division burst out of the smoke toward the beaches of Peleliu, and the coral erupted around them. Shells walked across the water in tall white columns. Amtraks took direct hits and vanished in orange fireballs, spilling burning men into the surf. Machine gun fire raked the tracks as they clawed up onto the sand, and the beach itself became a channel of flame mortar bursts and screaming metal. This was not the wild, wasteful defense of the early war. Every gun had been ranged. Every yard of that beach had been measured and pre-registered months in advance. The men dying in the first minutes were dying inside a machine that had been engineered with cold precision to kill exactly them. And the worst of it was not even on the beach. The worst of it waited inland in the ridges in the dark, where a Japanese colonel had built something the Marines had never faced before. In the first 2 parts of this story, we watched the Marines answer a question Tokyo could not solve. On Guadalcanal, they proved they could not be broken in the jungle. On the reef at Tarawa, they proved they could not be broken at the waterline, wading through a slaughter that should have thrown them back into the sea. And the Japanese, studying the wreckage of every defeat, finally reached a terrible conclusion. They could not stop the Marines at the shore, so they stopped trying. They would let the Marines land and then bleed them to death one cave at a time. Peleliu was the first island built entirely around that idea. And here, for the first time, the new Japanese doctrine was ready. This was no longer a test. This was a trap. The man who built it was Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, and he was the most dangerous defensive commander the Marines had yet met. He had studied every Marine campaign available to him. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, the landings across the Marshalls and New Guinea, and he had drawn the correct lessons where his predecessors had drawn the wrong ones. He threw out the banzai charge. He threw out the massed beach defense that Tarawa had proven futile. Instead, he turned the island's spine, a jagged coral massif called the Umur Brogol, into a fortress with no visible face. His men blasted and dug more than 500 caves into the ridges, connected by tunnels layered up the slopes so that each position covered 2 or 3 others. Steel doors sealed artillery pieces that rolled out to fire and rolled back before counterfire could answer. There were no clean targets. There was only the mountain, and the mountain was full of guns. And Nakagawa had done something else, something psychological. He had left the beaches lightly held on the surface, so that the pre-invasion bombardment would find little to destroy, and the landing would feel almost easy in its first moments, luring the Marines inland toward the ridges where the real defense waited. It was a trap baited with false hope. The bombardment itself set the tone for the whole grim affair. For days the warships pounded Peleliu, and then the admiral in charge of the naval gunfire announced that he had run out of targets, that there was nothing left worth shooting. It was one of the most catastrophic misjudgments of the campaign. Nakagawa's guns were not on the surface to be seen. They were sealed in the coral, waiting untouched by the shelling that was supposed to have annihilated them. When the Marines came ashore, expecting a broken island, the mountain opened up at full strength, and the men on the beach paid for a confidence that had never been justified. For the Japanese high command watching the Marines carve through the outer empire, this new doctrine was a source of grim hope. Their intelligence had confirmed what their frontline diaries had been screaming for 2 years, that the Marine assault could not be shattered by fire at the moment of landing. The numbers were undeniable and appalling. On island after island, the garrisons had died nearly to the last man while inflicting far fewer casualties than they suffered. Tarawa had cost Japan roughly 4,600 dead to kill about 1,000 Marines. That ratio was a death sentence for an empire with finite men. So Tokyo reoriented its entire Pacific strategy around a single word: attrition. If they could not win, they would make winning unbearable. They would trade lives at rates the Marines could sustain, and the American public perhaps could not, and they would build every remaining island into a meat grinder like Nakagawa's ridges. But the ridges were only the first surprise Peleliu held, because the plan on the American side was built on a catastrophic miscalculation. The commander of the 1st Marine Division, Major General William Rupertus, believed Peleliu would fall fast. He told his officers it would be rough but quick, a matter of a few days, perhaps 3 or 4. The whole operation had been sold as a short, sharp seizure of an airfield to protect the flank of the coming invasion of the Philippines. Correspondents were told to expect it wrapped up in a long weekend. That confidence rippled down through the ranks and shaped everything: the supply plan, the water, the ammunition, the will to keep pushing men forward on the assumption that the end was always just ahead. It was wrong. It was wrong by a margin measured in weeks and in blood. Peleliu would not take 4 days. It would take 73. The first day alone should have shattered the illusion. On the left flank, a single Marine company, under Captain George Hunt, fought its way onto a coral strongpoint called the Point, a fortified nose of rock bristling with guns that enfiladed the whole landing. Hunt's men took it in a savage close-quarters fight and then held it, nearly surrounded, cut off, running low on ammunition, through counterattack after counterattack, until the company that had started the day at full strength was reduced to a handful of survivors. Inland, the Marines had to charge straight across the open airfield, under artillery that turned the flat ground into a killing floor, and then absorb a Japanese tank counterattack that came clanking across the runway in the afternoon heat, met and destroyed by Marine armor bazookas and a dive bomber in a wild, dust-choked melee. By nightfall, the division had a foothold and a casualty list that mocked the promise of a quick victory. The 4-day battle was already a bloody fiction, and as the days piled up and the airfield was taken, but the ridges would not fall, a second crisis bloomed behind the first. Word began to spread even at the time that Peleliu might not have been necessary at all. The airfield proved far less valuable than promised. The Philippine landings could have bypassed the island entirely, leaving its garrison to wither on the vine, cut off and useless. Men were dying by the hundreds for a rock that the war may have been able to simply go around. That knowledge, hardening into certainty in the years afterward, turned Peleliu into one of the most bitter battles of the Pacific, a place where the courage was total and the purpose was in doubt. The recriminations began before the shooting even stopped, and in the middle of it stood the men who had to take the ridges anyway, because whatever the strategists had gotten wrong, the mountain was still full of guns and someone had to climb it. The men who climbed it first were the 1st Marines under Colonel Louis Puller, and what happened to them on the Umur Brogol became a byword for slaughter. The ridge that anchored the whole system earned a name that said everything: Bloody Nose Ridge. It was not one hill, but a tangle of them, sheer coral spines and gorges, with no soil and no cover, where a man could not dig a foxhole and had to build low walls of loose rock instead. The Japanese held the high ground, and the caves above every approach. To go up meant crossing open coral in the sightline of a dozen hidden guns. Puller sent his regiment up that ridge again and again. It was bled white. Some rifle companies lost more than half their men. By the time the 1st Marines were finally pulled off the line, the regiment had suffered casualties so severe it had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force, and the ridges still had not fallen. Doubt crept in where doubt was not supposed to live. Perhaps this could not be done at all. But then the fight found its answer, and the answer was not a breakthrough, it was a method. The method was patience turned into a weapon. If the caves could not be rushed, they would be destroyed one at a time. The Marines called it blowtorch and corkscrew. A tank or a half-track would ease forward and hose a cave mouth with a long stream of burning fuel. Flamethrower teams crawled close under covering fire and poured liquid flame into the firing slits. Then, demolition men moved up with satchel charges and sealed the opening with high explosive, entombing whatever was inside. One cave, then the next, then the next. It was brutal, methodical, unglamorous work, and it went on for weeks in heat that reached 115 degrees in air that stank of death and cordite, with almost no shade and a constant desperate shortage of water. Marines drank from oil-fouled cans and got sick. They fought thirst as hard as they fought the enemy. And still, cave by cave, they took the mountain apart. The conditions on that ridge became a kind of madness, all their own. There was no soil to bury anyone, so the dead lay where they fell, in the killing heat, and the smell became a physical weight that men carried in their throats. Land crabs and swarming flies moved through the rocks. Nights brought infiltrators slipping down from the caves so that no man truly slept, and the coral gave off the day's stored heat long after dark. The Japanese used the terrain with lethal patience, sniping from concealed slits, rolling grenades down the gorges, letting the Marines expose themselves, and then cutting them down. Every ridge taken revealed another behind it higher and better defended. The map of the Umurbrogol filled up with names the Marines gave the terrain out of exhaustion and gallows humor. The Five Sisters, the Horseshoe, Death Valley, Walt Ridge, each one a small hell that had to be cleared by hand. Partway through the siege, the Marines mounted a separate assault across the water onto the little island of Ngesibus just off Peleliu's northern tip, where the Japanese had built an airstrip and more fortified positions. The Amtraks churned across the narrow channel under covering fire. The Marines swarmed ashore, and the island was cleared in a sharp, fast action that showed how completely they had absorbed the lessons of the reef. Coordinated air support, tight naval gunfire Amtraks delivering men directly onto the beach. Ngesibus fell quickly, and at relatively light cost a bright, brutal contrast to the grinding agony of the main ridges and proof that when the Marines could bring their full method to bear, no defense held long. The Japanese fought exactly as Nakagawa had designed them to. They did not charge. They did not waste themselves. They held their caves and made the Marines come to them, and they killed at a rate no earlier island had managed. But the design, however brilliant, could only slow the machine, not stop it. Every sealed cave was a position that would never fire again. Every tunnel collapsed was a piece of the fortress gone for good. The Marines and the Army's 81st Division brought in to help finish the siege ground forward through the ridges in a slow constriction that squeezed Nakagawa's men into an ever-shrinking core. By late November, the defenders were out of water, out of ammunition, out of room. Nakagawa's command had killed and killed and killed, and it had bought time, and it had bought casualties, and in the end, it had bought nothing that could save it. On the 24th of November, with his defense collapsing into its final pocket, Nakagawa burned his regimental colors, reported that his mission was complete, and took his own life rather than be captured. A message attributed to him was recovered and translated afterward, and whether every word survived exactly or not, its meaning ran through the Japanese record like a confession. He wanted it recorded that the Marines had fought precisely as their legend promised, which was to say without stopping, and that he had no complaint about his own men or his own tactics. They had done everything that could be done against this particular enemy. And then the assessment that cut deepest of all. They were simply better at this than we were. It was not bitterness. It was the verdict of a professional who had built the finest defense of his career, executed it with total commitment, inflicted proportionally among the heaviest losses of the Pacific War, and watched it fail anyway. He had proven the Marines could be made to bleed. He had not been able to prove they could be made to stop. When it was finally over, the ledger of Peleliu was staggering. The battle that was supposed to last 4 days had lasted more than 10 weeks. Nakagawa's garrison of roughly 11,000 men was almost entirely destroyed, with only a couple of hundred taken alive, most of them laborers rather than soldiers. The Americans had lost more than 1,600 killed and suffered over 8,000 total casualties. 8 Marines and soldiers received the Medal of Honor for Peleliu, an extraordinary concentration of the nation's highest award, and a grim measure of how much the fighting had demanded. The airfield had been taken. The island had been secured. And a shadow hung over all of it, because so many had come to believe the whole terrible siege might have been avoided. The men had given everything for a victory, whose value would be argued over for the rest of the century. But strategically, Peleliu taught both sides the shape of the war to come, and neither side liked what it saw. For the Japanese, the island confirmed that the attrition doctrine worked as a way to inflict pain, even if it could not win. Nakagawa's caves had cost the Americans dearly, and Tokyo took that lesson and prepared to apply it on a far larger and more terrible scale. For the Americans, Peleliu was a brutal preview. Every assumption that a defended island could be seized quickly had died in the Brogol. The Marines now knew what the new Japanese doctrine meant. It meant no more 3-day victories. It meant siege warfare against fortresses buried in rock cave by cave week after week, at a cost that would make even the reef at Tarawa look cheap. The blowtorch and corkscrew method they had forged on Bloody Nose Ridge would become the standard grammar of every assault still ahead. They had learned how to take the caves. Now they would have to do it again, and the next island would have more caves than any of them could yet imagine. There was a human cost beyond the casualty figures too, one that would echo for decades. The men who survived Peleliu carried it differently than they carried the cleaner victories. The pointless-seeming ferocity of it, the heat, the smell, the friends lost yard by yard for a rock. The war might have skipped, marked a generation of Marines who would spend the rest of their lives insisting that Peleliu be remembered when the histories rushed past it toward more famous names. The battle received far less attention at home than its cost deserved, in part because it was fought in the shadow of the return to the Philippines, in part because its very necessity was in question. But inside the Corps, Peleliu became a touchstone, a proof of what the institution could endure and still accomplish when the objective made no sense, and the enemy had built the perfect trap, and the only way forward was straight up the ridge into the guns. Because Peleliu was only the rehearsal. The commander who had watched this new doctrine prove itself was already at work on a volcanic island far to the north, and he was a more brilliant and more ruthless engineer of defense than Nakagawa had ever been. His name was Tadamichi Kuribayashi. He was burrowing 16 miles of tunnels into a place called Iwo Jima, forbidding banzai charges entirely, and building a fortress designed for one purpose, to make the United States Marine Corps suffer as no attacking army in history had ever suffered before. And there, in the black sand and the sulfur smoke, the war between the Marines and the men who could not stop them would reach its most famous and most costly climax, and the last honest verdict on what the Marines truly were would finally be spoken by the one senior Japanese officer who would live to speak it. It would take Iwo Jima and then the vast bloodletting of Okinawa beyond it to force that verdict into the open. The story has one final chapter, and it is the one that answers everything. The chapter where the enemy himself, having tried every defense a brilliant and disciplined mind could devise, sets down at last exactly what he saw, and calls the Marines by the single word that no defense of his had ever been able to overcome. At 9 o'clock on the morning of the 19th of February 1945, the Marines came ashore on Iwo Jima into black volcanic sand, and for a few minutes the island was almost silent. Then Kuribayashi's fortress opened up, and the beach disappeared under a curtain of fire. Artillery zeroed in, months earlier, fell with surgical accuracy. Machine guns firing from unseen slits in the rock cut across the sand in interlocking arcs. Mortars walked through the crowded beachhead, and the fine black ash swallowed men's boots so they could not run, could barely crawl while the shells came down and down and down. Bodies and shattered equipment piled at the waterline. There was no cover on that beach, no defilade, nothing but soft ash and the guns of a mountain that had been engineered over 8 patient months to turn this exact stretch of sand into the deadliest few hundred yards on Earth. And the man who built it had promised his soldiers something no Japanese commander had promised before. He did not promise victory. He promised that every Marine would bleed for every step. Across 3 parts, we have followed one long question. On Guadalcanal, the Marines proved they could not be broken in the jungle. At Tarawa, they proved they could not be broken at the waterline. At Peleliu, they proved that even a perfect trap of caves and tunnels could only slow them, never stop them. And a dying colonel confessed that the Marines had simply been better at war than his own men. The Japanese had spent 3 years searching for the wall the Marines could not climb. Now, on this sulfur-stinking volcano, the most brilliant defensive mind Japan possessed had built the highest wall of all, and here at last the war between the Marines and the men who could not stop them would produce its final and most honest verdict. Because success in the end always carries a price, and the price of what the Marines had become was about to be counted in full. The man who built Iwo Jima's defense was Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, and he was the most dangerous of them all. He had studied every lesson the earlier battles taught. He looked at the bonsai charge and saw waste. He looked at the beach defense and saw men dying for nothing under naval guns. So he did something almost unthinkable to the culture around him. He forbade the suicide charges entirely. He ordered his soldiers not to die gloriously, but to survive to stay in their holes and keep killing to make every man of theirs worth 10 of the enemy. His engineers carved roughly 11 miles of tunnels through the volcanic rock, linking hundreds of bunkers, blockhouses, and gun positions into a single fortress buried inside the island itself. There was almost nothing to bombard on the surface, because the defense was underground. Nearly 21,000 men waited in that stone honeycomb, invisible, patient, ready to fire, and vanish, and fire again. Kuribayashi did not intend to hold Iwo Jima forever. He intended to make its capture so appalling that America would flinch at the cost of the home island still to come. For 36 days, the Marines climbed into that fortress and took it apart. It was Peleliu multiplied the blowtorch and the corkscrew applied across an entire island, cave by cave, tunnel by tunnel, in a grinding siege with no flanks and no rear, because the enemy was beneath their feet. They would seal a bunker and find its garrison had slipped through a tunnel to fire from behind them an hour later. They fought for ridges and gorges and shattered stone with names that meant nothing to anyone who had not bled there, and the arithmetic came out the way Kuribayashi had designed it. Iwo Jima was the only major battle of the Pacific in which the American attackers suffered more casualties than the Japanese defenders. The Marines lost nearly 7,000 men killed and more than 26,000 total casualties, an entire generation of young men consumed on 8 square miles of volcanic rock. Kuribayashi had achieved what no one before him had managed. He had made the Marines pay a price higher than the one they inflicted. And still, at the end of 36 days, the island was theirs. His finest defense had produced maximum cost and had not stopped them. Kuribayashi himself vanished into the fighting in the final days, most likely leading a last desperate attack in the northern end of the island, and his body was never identified among the dead. He had denied the Americans even the certainty of his death, the way he had denied them every easy thing on that island. And the 27 Medals of Honor, awarded for Iwo Jima, the most ever given for a single battle, testified to what it had cost to pry the fortress open, an entire island's worth of individual acts of near-suicidal courage, repeated day after day in the ash. Somewhere in the tunnels during those final days, a Japanese private named Hajime Kondo survived where most of the garrison died, and he was captured in late March. When American intelligence questioned him about what set the Marines apart from every other enemy he had faced, he thought for a long time before he answered, and what he said became one of the most precise things anyone on the Japanese side ever spoke about their enemy. In our doctrine, he explained, the officer is the mind, and the soldiers are the body, and without the mind, the body does not know what to do. But the Marines were different. Every man seemed to carry the whole plan inside himself. When the officer fell, nothing changed. The attack continued in the same direction with the same purpose as if the officer were still alive. We destroyed their structure, Kondo said, and the attack continued. We destroyed it again, and it continued again. And in the end, we understood that there was no structure to destroy. The structure was inside each man. The structure was inside each man. That single sentence spoken by a defeated private in a prison camp was the answer to the question Tokyo had first asked in the summer of 1942. It was why the wade across the Tarawa reef had not broken them, why the ridges of Peleliu had fallen cave by cave, why decapitating a Marine command changed nothing when decapitating a Japanese command changed everything. The Marine Corps had taken its doctrine and installed it not in a chain of command, but in the individual man so completely that you could destroy every structure above him, and the mission would still walk forward on its own. The Japanese, who had built their entire army around the indispensable officer, had spent 3 years trying to counter something they could neither anticipate nor replicate. And on the 5th day of that terrible battle, the world was handed the image that would come to stand for all of it, though few understood what it truly showed. On the 23rd of February 1945, a patrol fought its way to the summit of Mount Suribachi, the dead volcano at the island's southern tip, and raised an American flag. A second larger flag went up soon after, and a photographer named Joe Rosenthal caught 6 men driving the pole into the rock in a single frozen instant. The photograph became perhaps the most famous image of the entire war. But it was not a picture of triumph, whatever it later came to mean. The battle was 5 days old and would rage for another month. The volcano beneath those men was still full of Japanese soldiers in its tunnels. The flag went up while the island was still trying to kill everyone on it. And of the 6 men in that photograph, 3 would not leave Iwo Jima alive, killed in the weeks of fighting that followed the moment the shutter closed. The image did not show men who had won. It showed men doing a thing that needed doing in a place still trying to kill them, treating the fact that it was trying to kill them as merely a condition to be managed. That was the truth of the Marines hidden inside the most triumphant image of the war. But the final word did not come from Iwo Jima. It came from the last and largest battle of all, and from the one senior Japanese officer who lived to speak it. On the 1st of April 1945, the Americans landed on Okinawa, and for nearly 3 months, the 6th and other Marine divisions fighting alongside the Army ground their way across the island against a defense built on everything Japan had learned. Serving as chief operations officer for that defense was Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, a cool, analytical professional who had helped design the entire strategy. He watched the Marines fight for 3 months. He studied them under every condition of stress and exhaustion and adversity a defender could impose. And unlike Nakagawa, unlike Kuribayashi, unlike almost every senior officer who had faced them, Yahara survived, ordered at the end to live so that someone would carry the story home and taken prisoner rather than dying with his command. Okinawa was the largest and bloodiest amphibious campaign of the entire Pacific War, nearly 3 months of fighting that cost more than 12,000 American lives and over 100,000 Japanese, a foretaste so terrible of what an invasion of the home islands might cost that it shaped the gravest decisions of the war's final summer. Yahara had helped orchestrate that defense, feeding the Marines and soldiers into ridgelines and cave complexes that made them earn every yard, and he had watched day after day as they earned it anyway. Yahara spent the rest of his life turning over what he had seen, and decades later he set it down in a memoir. He wrote that he had spent those 3 months searching for something that would stop these men. He found things that would slow them. He found things that would cost them dearly. He never found the thing that would stop them. And then he offered the conclusion that stands as the most complete verdict any enemy ever delivered on the United States Marine Corps. In his judgment, he wrote, "The Marine Corps of 1945 was the finest infantry assault force that had ever existed, not the bravest. There had been brave armies throughout all of history, the finest." And he insisted the distinction mattered more than anything else he could say. Bravery, he explained, is what men bring to a battle. Fineness is what an institution builds over long years and installs in its people so completely that they carry it into battle, whether they happen to feel brave or not. Fineness. It was an unusual word for a soldier to reach for, and Yahara meant it to carry its fullest weight. Not merely good, not merely effective, not merely courageous. Fine in the sense of something worked and reworked until the raw material has become qualitatively different from what it began as. And that was exactly the story. The men who fought across the Pacific had not been born superhuman. They were the sons of farmers and mechanics and dock workers, ordinary young Americans, no braver at birth than anyone else. What made them what Yahara described was not their blood. It was the institution that had taken them in and reforged them, an institution that had itself nearly been abolished after the First World War, that had survived by seizing a mission everyone called impossible, and that had spent 20 years solving a problem the entire military world had declared unsolvable. The fineness Yahara saw on Okinawa had been built in obscure schoolhouses at Quantico, by men whose names no one remembers, and it had been paid for in blood on a dozen beaches. This was the true protagonist of the whole story, not a single hero, but a culture portable to any shore, operational under any condition. That is why the legacy of what the Marines built outlived the war by generations, and why it never really depended on any one weapon or tactic. The amphibious doctrine that Gallipoli had supposedly proven impossible became the foundation of American power projection for the rest of the century. Just 5 years after the Pacific War ended, that same doctrine executed the landing at Incheon in Korea in 1950, a stroke so audacious launched across treacherous tides, much like the ones that had once doomed the boats at Tarawa, that it reversed the course of an entire war overnight. The Amtraks that had crawled over the reef at Tarawa evolved into the assault vehicles the Corps still rides ashore today. And the deeper principle, the decentralization of decision, the insistence that the lowest-ranking man carry the full intent of the mission inside himself, spread far beyond the Marine Corps, shaping how modern militaries think about command, in an age when the officer really can be cut off in an instant. The idea that survived Kondo's tunnels became doctrine studied in war colleges around the world. But the largest lesson was never really about tactics or technology at all. It was about what an institution can become when it knows precisely what it is building for and takes the building seriously enough to do it right. The Japanese had built their military around a beautiful and fragile idea that spiritual intensity could overcome material reality, that the will to die could substitute for the means to win. The Marines had built theirs around something less romantic and far more durable. The conviction that selection training doctrine and hard institutional memory applied with sufficient aggression by sufficiently prepared men could overcome any defense a human mind could construct. One of those philosophies produced banzai charges dying on the wire. The other produced men who kept walking forward when everything around them had been destroyed. The war between them was at bottom a war between two theories of what makes a fighting force, and the tunnels of Iwo Jima settled the argument. And there is one final detail hidden inside the most famous image of that whole war that almost no one knew until very recently. For more than 70 years, the world believed it knew the names of the 6 men in Rosenthal's photograph on Suribachi. The identities had been fixed in 1945, carved into monuments printed in every account taught to every school child. But the black sand and the chaos of battle had blurred the truth. In 2016, after careful forensic analysis of the photographs, the Marine Corps announced that one of the men long identified in the picture had not actually been in it, and that a different Marine, Harold Schultz, had been standing there all along, a man who had gone home and lived a quiet life and never once corrected the record, never sought the credit. Then, in 2019, the Corps revised the roster yet again, identifying another of the figures as Harold Keller. Two of the men frozen forever in the most reproduced photograph of the 20th century had been misnamed for the better part of a century, and one had carried that anonymity to his grave without complaint. It was, in its own quiet way, the most fitting truth of all. The image was never really about the individuals. It was about the thing they were part of, which did not care who got the credit. That anonymity is the heart of the whole story. The Japanese called them devil dogs in the mud and the blood and the darkness, and they meant it not as flattery, but as something closer to an exorcism. A word whispered about a force that did not behave by the rules of human endurance. They built their finest defenses against these men on island after island, and they watched those defenses fail. And the honest ones, the professionals, the analysts who wrote in diaries and memoirs in interrogation rooms, what they had actually seen said the same thing in different words across 3 years and a dozen beaches. They said they had never encountered anything like this before in all their years of war. And what they were describing was not a miracle, and not a legend, and not some exceptional national character that could never be explained. They were describing the product of an institution that had spent 2 decades solving a single terrible problem, and had solved it well enough that when the problem arrived in reality, no one else on Earth was as ready to meet it. From an institution nearly abolished and fighting for its very survival, to a doctrine the whole world called impossible to the black sand of Iwo Jima, and the last honest verdict of a defeated enemy. The Marines proved that fineness is not born but built. That courage can be manufactured and distributed and installed in ordinary men until it becomes as reliable as any weapon in the arsenal. They paid for that proof with tens of thousands of lives across the islands of the Pacific, and they changed forever what the world understood a fighting force could be. Nakagawa said they were simply better at it. Kondo said the structure was inside each man. And Yahara, who had spent 3 months trying and failing to stop them, reached for a single word and called them not the bravest, but the finest that had ever existed. He offered it without pleasure as a professional's honest reckoning with the men who had beaten him. And in the end, that single word from the enemy's own mouth, spoken across the wreckage of everything he had tried, is the truest monument the United States Marine Corps of the Second World War ever received.